Hello and welcome to Global Lens. Over the next 30 minutes, we put the spotlight on all the top stories from around the world. I am Parikshit Luthra. These are the global headlines we are tracking. US President Donald Trump threatens to impose 50% tariff on Brazil, cites the trial against former far-right leader Bolsonaro as one of the reasons. Brazilian President Lula says his country will respond with reciprocity. Trump also sends letters threatening higher tariffs to 6 other nations. At least 119 people confirmed dead after flooding in the US state of Texas. More than 100 people still remain missing in what is the worst flood to hit the United States in nearly a century. United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio meets Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov in Malaysia, says he expressed his frustration and disappointment over the lack of progress in resolving the war, adds that Lavrov shared a new idea on Ukraine but does not provide further details. Let's take a look at how markets are faring around the world. Asian markets were mixed as investors digested Trump's tariff threats and Bank of Korea's decision to keep rates steady. Shanghai Kospi and Hang Seng gained, while Japan's Nikkei ended in the red. On Dalal Street, Nifty and Sensex gave up early gains to end 0.5% lower. European stocks remained largely in positive territory for the 4th straight day as investors brushed off tariff uncertainties. On Wall Street, Nasdaq hit a record high at the start of trade before giving up these gains. US President Trump has stepped up his attack against Brazil, first by words and now by action. He has imposed a 50% tariff on Brazil, the highest among the 21 countries that received Trump's tariff letter in the last few days. In the letter, Trump blames Brazil of insidious attack on free elections, free speech, rights of Americans. Further goes on to blame Brazil for blocking US social media platforms and threatening them with penalty. Moreover, this levy is linked to Trump's support to former President Jair Bolsonaro. But one cannot deny the fact that this comes just days after Trump warned BRICS nations with an additional tariff if these nations indulged in anti-American policies. Further, it needs to be noted that it is the first BRICS nation to receive a letter after this warning and the second BRICS nation to have received the letter in this series. This move by the United States is facing the anger of Brazilian President Luiz Lula da Silva, who reacted saying, and I quote, "Any unilateral tariff increase will be addressed in accordance with Brazil's economic reciprocity law." Now let's take a look at US and Brazil's trade. US is Brazil's second largest trading partner after China and has a $7.4 billion trade surplus with Brazil, while US goods imports from Brazil stood at $42 billion in 2024. Its exports to Brazil was around $50 billion. To understand the impact of US tariffs on Brazil and if this can be seen as an action taken against the BRICS bloc, we're now joined by Richard Baldwin, Professor of International Economics at the IMD Business School. Thank you very much, Professor Baldwin, for joining us. Today, European markets, US markets, and markets around the world opened largely in positive territory. Investors were brushing off these concerns raised by tariffs that Donald Trump has imposed over the last few days. Why do you think this is happening?
Anticipate. And the markets, I think, largely anticipated that the tariffs would go up in this phase. And what happened actually this week was that for most of the countries, the tariffs went up by less than was said they would go up in April 2nd. So in some ways, it was a lot of non-news. Moreover, the deadline was pushed from the 9th of July to 1st of August, suggesting that their eventual tariffs might be even lower. So having already put into the market the idea that the tariffs were going up, what actually happened this week wasn't much news. And I think that's why they reacted as they did.
Right. I'd also like to ask you about Brazil. Specifically on the issue of treatment to Bolsonaro, President Trump imposed a 50% tariff on Brazil. Now, Brazil has vowed to hit back. Do you think this is now a clear case of weaponization of tariffs by Donald Trump?
Oh, yeah, this is way out of line with everything else he's talked about. And in fact, the legal authority he used to justify the tariffs on April 2nd, in which Brazil only got 10%, viewed the US trade deficit as a national security risk. But the US, as you pointed out, has a trade surplus with Brazil, not a deficit. So the idea that he's now using this to justify some complaint about some other country's internal judicial laws undermines the legal standing of the whole tariffs. So I think that one has to keep in mind that this won't be the first time that Donald Trump announced something very exciting and then backed off a little while later, simply to generate the headlines and get the energy out there, but then back off. But it is completely out of line with all the rest. The rest was mostly based on bilateral deficits.
Right. I would also like to ask you about the fact that tariff is causing so many uncertainty among nations in Southeast Asia, around the world. Is it really helping the United States? Currently, the US Treasury Secretary is saying they are going to have at least $300 billion in revenue from tariffs by the end of 2025. That is one way to look at it. But isn't this going to be hurting American businesses at some point?
Oh, yes, it already is. I mean, the thing is, if you look at the U.S. stock market, you have to remember that something like 40% of it is in these service companies who are really not in the business of tariffs, which are now mostly on manufactured goods. So, your Googles and your Microsofts, those have nothing to do with trade in tariffs on manufactured goods. But the idea that the tariff revenues are gain, well, a tariff is really just a tax on imports. It's really just a sales tax. So this tax revenue that the Treasury Secretary is talking about is at least partly being paid by U.S. citizens. In any case, the middle class is facing higher cost of living because of these tariffs. And I think ultimately that's why the tariffs that Trump announced for most of the countries were lower than the ones that he had announced in April. And I think that kind of pressure of cost of living hurting his base, therefore leading him to at least exempt more. I think we'll see more of that going forward.
Yeah, and what we would also like to ask you, what's happening is that he's imposing these reciprocal tariffs, saying this is going to come into effect from the 1st of August if you don't agree to our terms of trade. And this is apart from the sectoral tariffs, such as copper, which is going to be 50%, automobiles, which is 25%, and 50% for steel and aluminium. What's going to happen to global supply chains of all these key materials?
Well, so what this is happening is the U.S. is raising the cost of making anything that involves steel or aluminum or copper inside the United States, but not outside the United States. So it's actually lowering the competitiveness of American manufacturers compared to the whole rest of the world. So I don't think it's going to mess up the supply chains for companies who are based outside the United States. In fact, they may very well gain because the deflected materials may get sold for cheaper elsewhere. So I don't think it'll be very disruptive for the entire global value chain, this particular thing on the metal tariffs. Now, the tariffs that have been put on the Southeast Asian countries and China are certainly leading to many companies to think about moving elsewhere. And India is a very classic example, with the iPhone, a very high-profile example, where fear of tariffs by America on Chinese exports of iPhones led Apple to start producing a lot more in India. So there's a plus and a minus of these things. I think it's mostly, though, disrupting the U.S. economy and the U.S. supply chains.
When it comes to a transshipment tax, can that even be imposed, considering that supply chains today are so closely intertwined?
So there's among us trade economists and trade experts, we're trying to figure out what he was talking about with transshipment. So there is and always has been an incentive to misrepresent where goods come from, and you sort of direct it through somebody who has, say, a free trade agreement with the United States and pretend it was made in Mexico when it was actually made in China. So to stop that, the U.S. government has what they call rules of origin, which define how you define where a good is from. Now, the tariff, for example, on Vietnam of 20%, that would follow the usual rules of origin according to U.S. law. He seemed to be talking about a different type of rule of origin, where if it was transshipped, that it would face a higher tariff. Now, if it was obviously transshipped, that's tariff fraud, And so it would be charged, first of all, there'd be a fine on the company who did it, but also eventually it would be charged the tariff from the country that actually came from. So he's invented a whole new category of trade, which nobody has quite figured out how it works. And we haven't seen any documentation, so we don't know how it's going to work. But I think he's trying to essentially get countries to strip China out of their supply chain in this indirect way. But how it works out, we don't know.
Donald Trump has also publicly backed a legislation which says that countries like India and China, which purchase Russian energy, should be fined and punished with a 500% tariff. Can that even be done? Is that even possible? If you impose that, will it become a joke beyond a point?
So let me put it this way. I mean, Donald Trump, if you've been listening to a while, when he talks, it's about communicating an emotion or his instinct or a threat. When he talks, he uses words to communicate how he feels. And he uses words that sometimes have numbers in them, but you shouldn't pay attention to those numbers. Pay attention to the feeling underneath those numbers. And then he can change them tomorrow, the numbers. He can change them a month later. He changes them all the time. So when he says something like 500%, you shouldn't listen to that number because, as you rightly pointed out, 500%, that's, I mean, there actually are a few tariffs in the world that high, but it just means there's no trade. But when he says 500%, it means he would be angry if that happened. And I think that's the way you have to interpret it. Donald Trump uses numbers in his discussion like most chefs use parsley as a garnish. He just puts it on. It doesn't really mean that much.
Right. That's a very interesting conversation we've had with you, Professor Baldwin, and thank you very much for giving us an overview of Donald Trump's policies and how much of this he can actually execute in the days to come. Thank you so much once again for being with us.
Thank you.
All right, let's move on and get you more news from around the world. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced the creation of a new $2.3 billion package to support Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction efforts. This package is in agreement with international and bilateral public financial institutions. She said this fund will be the largest equity fund globally to support the reconstruction of war-torn Ukraine. Meanwhile, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni called for tougher sanctions on Russia during the opening of the conference in Rome. Kremlin spokesperson said the peace talks between Russia and Ukraine have not been stalled. This comes after US President Donald Trump said US will resume the supply of weapons to Kyiv and that Trump is unhappy with Putin. The Russian spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said it's awaiting a signal from Kyiv for the next round of talks. The Italian candy maker behind Nutella and Ferrero Rocher is nearing a deal to buy cereal brand Kellogg. This deal, which is valued around $3 billion, is expected to help Ferrero's North American ambitions. As per Wall Street Journal, this deal could be finalized within a week. At least 120 people have died in the devastating flash floods in Texas, with Kerr County alone accounting for 95 fatalities. Ongoing search operations are underway to find people who are stuck in the debris. Among the dead are 59 adults and 36 children, with 27 victims still unidentified. Coming up, US and China are in the race for AI dominance. Who is ahead and what kind of AI models are going to work in future? We find out on the other side. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Global Lens. The artificial intelligence revolution is now a geopolitical chess match between US and China with trillions of dollars at stake. This is the topic of discussion in the recent article in the Foreign Affairs magazine, and the article is themed "The Real AI Race: Why America Needs More Than Innovation to Compete with China." Now, while Silicon Valley giants have dominated headlines, China has been mounting a relentless challenge, blending state-backed strategy with cost innovation, according to this article. Trump's first move after he took office at the White House was to sign an executive order declaring the need to sustain and enhance America's global AI dominance. Private companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, DeepMind in the US and DeepSeek in China have been rushing to innovate, supported by their respective governments. Sample this. According to the 2025 AI Index report from Stanford University, in 2024, US private AI investment grew to $109 billion, 12 times China's $9.3 billion. However, US export controls have crippled China's access to advanced chips, helping US maintain an edge. Yet, Chinese firms have managed to adapt. The nation's leading firms are developing tech that trail their US counterparts by just months. Beijing's centralized approach is helping firms harness private sector innovations more quickly, while US open system is inherently vulnerable to espionage, and price is becoming the new battleground in AI wars. DeepSeek's R1 is one of the most affordable high-performance models on the market today as AI becomes more embedded in the digital economy. The winners will be those who can deliver both performance and cost savings at scale. Now, when it comes to national security, partnerships between leading AI labs and the Pentagon and other national security agencies are only in nascent stages. However, China's authoritarian system eases civil-military integration, providing it with a structural edge in AI adoption. Ultimately, the biggest challenge in the AI arms race may be security, and that, ironically, could be the biggest opportunity. A shared incentive for the US and China to collaborate and contain the risks of AI misuse before it escalates beyond control. Now, joining me now to discuss this further is the author of this article in the Foreign Affairs magazine, Jim Mitre, Vice President and Director of RAND Global and Emerging Risks. Thank you very much for joining us, Jim. Let me begin by asking you, how would you describe the current rivalry between US and China on artificial intelligence?
And thanks so much for having me. Well, the rivalry right now is largely discussed in terms of its relevance for achieving a technological lead in AI. But in fact, what we argue in this article is that there are 5 distinct AI races, and it's helpful to understand them all so that the US government can come up with a comprehensive strategy that addresses them all. So in brief, the 5 interrelated races are: first, the race to innovate. And this is a contest to develop the most advanced AI, potentially even artificial general intelligence. The second is the race for national security integration. And this is adopting AI in military systems and in the intelligence community. The third is the race for economic integration. And so this is the capacity to diffuse AI across the entire economy to boost productivity, gain a competitive edge in key sectors like manufacturing and logistics. The fourth is the race to build the global tech ecosystem. And this is about the competition outside of the US and China and around the world, building infrastructure, chips, data centers, technical standards, and the like. And the fifth race is the race that we should avoid. It's the race to catastrophe. Given how powerful this technology is, there's real risks associated with it to be misused, potentially have loss of control of the technology. So how are we going to guard against that risk?
All right. Let me also ask you about why is it important to win or be ahead in this competition for artificial general intelligence?
Yeah, well, AI is one of the, if not perhaps the most important technology of the current era. The first to achieve a significant breakthrough in AI, such as something like artificial general intelligence, which is human level or potentially even superhuman level intelligence across a wide range of cognitive tasks. Whichever country achieves that first could have a tremendous boost in economic productivity, increase efficiencies, develop new products and markets, could create new military weapons that provide the military a significant advantage. And then it could also potentially be relevant for science and technology and unleash a range of new breakthroughs there that could radically change the world. So the potential advantages here are quite significant. Now, I'd say that there's also a lot of uncertainty over whether or not that's the case, and if certain technological thresholds will actually materialize to provide such advantage. But it's quite possible that it could.
More than retaining intellectual property and a security risk, it's about whether you have this talent for the long term. You may be paying Chinese origin talent a lot of money, but will you be able to retain them in the long run? In fact, studies have shown that China is absolutely fine with their talent going abroad to work, gain experience, but they are sure that that talent will return home one day to work and contribute to Chinese innovation and Chinese economy. Is that a worrying trend that when it comes to the skill pool, there the US may not have a lead?
Yes, absolutely. So, the United States for a long time has been a very attractive place for top talent around the world to come and, engage in a wide range of industries. And that's certainly the case when it comes to artificial intelligence. So, the United States still being a place where people want to come and work and contribute to development technology is very important for U.S. interests. But I know too that the Chinese aren't they're sensitive about these concerns also. So even with DeepSeek, they're one of their leading AI companies. My understanding is they've been limiting the ability for researchers from DeepSeek to travel abroad now because they're actually worried about losing some of that talent. And so there are steps that the Chinese are taking to safeguard their talent base.
Right. Now, let me also speak about how effective is the US government's current approach in encouraging development of future AI models?
Sorry, can you repeat that question? It didn't come through very well.
Yeah. How effective, according to you, is the US government's current approach in encouraging development of future AI models?
I'd say it's a mixed effort so far. On the good side of the ledger, the US government has engaged in semiconductor export controls, which have helped US companies retain a lead, particularly relative to China. And so we're seeing a lot of evidence of that the export controls actually have been helpful in that regard. The government is also not engaged in any regulation that could slow down AI progress in America. And it's currently now actively looking to increase energy supplies, which is one of the potential limiters of future AI development and application. On the negative side, to your point earlier, there's been some steps by the US government potentially to discourage talented foreign nationals from working in the United States. There's also been a bit of pulling back on investment in basic AI and research. Now, what's unclear is whether or not recent steps by the government to offshore critical data center infrastructure in the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia is going to work out well or not. That's an area of just uncertainty. It might be a brilliant move. It might backfire and give China, a backdoor into some of this technology. So we'll have to see how that plays out in execution.
Right. How important would the US's cooperation be with countries like India in order to have secure and reliable innovation in artificial intelligence?
Well, I think the US-India cooperation is highly important for several reasons. First, both nations share democratic values. And when we think about developing this technology, it's important that AI actually reflects democratic principles and values as opposed to China's model of digital authoritarianism. Second, to the discussion earlier on talent, India represents a massive market and pool of technical and scientific talent that is important for the United States to engage with and collaborate with on the broader AI ecosystem. And then finally, there's an important geopolitical dynamic here. Strengthening India's AI capabilities serves as a counterweight, if you will, to China's growing influence in the Indo-Pacific.
All right, US versus China when it comes to the race for artificial intelligence. Thank you, Jim, for joining us on the program. Shifting focus now to the trending stories. Dubai's Emirates Airlines has entered into a preliminary agreement with cryptocurrency platform Crypto.com. This will allow customers to make payments through crypto trading platforms' payment services. The integrated feature is set to be out sometime by next year. With this, the airline is aiming to attract a younger, tech-savvy customer base. A dog saved 60 lives in Siati village, located in Himachal Pradesh's Mandi district. This after the dog started barking and howling, which alerted the pet dog's owner, who realized that the heavy downpour had triggered a landslide in the neighborhood. Minutes after, 60 people were moved to safer locations before a massive landslide hit the region. Hawaii's most active volcano has erupted again with lava fountains reaching heights of almost 1,200 feet. The Hawaiian Volcano Observatory warned that emissions of volcanic gas, a mix of water, vapor, carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide, may be elevated this time around. World number one Yannick Sinner shrugged off injury fears to cruise into the Wimbledon semi-finals, where he will face seven-time Wimbledon champion Novak Djokovic. The other semis will be played between Carlos Alcaraz and Taylor Fritz tomorrow. In an upset in the women's single, top seed Sabalenka lost to Amanda Anisimova in 3 sets. The second women's semi-final will be played between 5-time Grand Slam winner Iga Swiatek and Belinda Bencic. Stars flocked to Paris for designer Demna's last haute couture for Valencia before his move to Gucci. Actor Nicole Kidman and Naomi Watts and singer Katy Perry were among the attendees. Demna was made creative director at Balenciaga in 2016 after stints at Maison, Margiela, Louis Vuitton and his own label Wetman. On Final Cut today, torrential rains unleashed flash floods in American state of New Mexico, killing at least 3 people, including 2 young children, and leaving dozens trapped in homes and vehicles in the resort village of Ruodoso. According to a statement from the village, the victims, a 4-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a man, were swept away by the floods and later found dead. Rescue efforts were ongoing as of late Tuesday. That's all on tonight's Global Lens. Thank you for watching and goodbye.